Now, there are some things a man learns out in the high country that no book ever taught him. And one of the first is this: a horse knows the world in ways a man never will. Out there, on a frostbitten scrub flat, in the last hour of daylight, the wind carries stories a body can't hear, and the ground holds memories the rest of us walk right over. On this particular evening, late in the autumn of a year, I won't trouble you with a dapple-grey gelding by the name of Cutter was moving across that open flat all by his lonesome. His reins trailed loose in the dust behind him, no rider in the saddle, no hand on the leather, and yet he walked with the kind of calm purpose you'd swear belonged to a creature who knew exactly where he was bound. The sun was bleeding gold across the western rim of the world, and every step that horse took kicked up a little cloud of dust that hung shining in the cold air before it settled. Now I want you to picture that flat the way it truly was. The grass had gone brittle and silver with the first hard frosts. The sage stood stiff as old men's bones. Off in the far distance, maybe a mile or better, there stood a low timber shelter, a waystation built by hands long gone, its single window throwing out a thin amber glow against the gathering dark. Most horses, left to their own devices, will drift back toward home, toward the smell of their own herd, toward whatever pasture they last grazed. But not this one, not on this night. Cutter walked toward that distant light like a man walks toward a voice he recognizes, neither hurried nor afraid, his ears pricked forward, his big dark eyes fixed on something none of us could yet see. The cold was settling in fast, the way it does in those open lands, the kind of cold that creeps up through your boots and sets your jaw to aching. And still that gray horse kept on, his hooves crunching the frosted ground, his breath rolling out in soft clouds that the dying light turned the color of honey. There was nothing else moving on that whole expanse. No birds, no cattle, no sign of human life, save for that one far lantern. Just a horse, and the wide and lonesome country, and a sense, if you'd been standing there to feel it, that something old and quiet was unfolding, something that had been set in motion long before this evening ever came. You might say, a riderless horse on a frozen flat is just a horse that's wandered off, and you'd be within your rights to say it. But I've lived long enough on these dusty trails to tell you that sometimes an animal carries a knowing that runs deeper than instinct, deeper than memory, down into some place we don't have words for. And as Cutter pressed on toward that thin and welcoming light, his trailing reins drawing twin lines through the frost, the whole world seemed to hold its breath and wait. The sun slipped lower. The shadows stretched long and blue across the flat, and somewhere out there in the deepening dark, a story that two strangers had each carried alone was about to fold itself together with a dapple-gray horse leading the way. He did not stumble, he did not pause, he simply walked, sure as Sunday, toward the one lit window in all that empty land, as though he'd been called by name. Back at the dark edge of the pine timber, a man stood watching, and that man's name was Amos. He was the rider that gray horse had left behind, and I'll tell you plain, he had never in all his years on the mountain seen the like of what he was watching now. Amos was not a young man, nor was he old, but he carried himself like a fellow who'd spent the better part of his life talking more to weather and game trails than to people. His face was weathered the way a cedar fence post goes weathered, all hard lines and quiet endurance, and across one side of his jaw ran a pale scar he'd earned in a way he never cared to speak of. Just now that jaw was set tight enough to crack a walnut, For his horse, his cutter, the animal that had carried him faithful through 8 hard winters, had simply turned and walked away from him out across the open flat, without so much as a backward glance. He dismounted only a moment to tighten a cinch and study his bearings, and the next thing he knew, the gray was gone, drifting off toward that distant light, like he had a mind and a mission all his own. Amos had called to him once, low and sharp, the way a man calls a dog he expects to mind. Cutter had not so much as flicked an ear. He'd called again, sharper, and still nothing. And now he just stood there at the tree line with the cold pine shadows at his back, his amber eyes stunned and unsettled, watching the shape of his horse grow small against the failing day. In the breast pocket of his buckskin coat, half crumpled where he'd shoved it that morning, there wrote a letter. And a folded square of paper sealed with a dab of dark wax, stamped with the mark of a frontier postmaster, and Amos had carried it near 100 miles to reach this very flat. He hadn't read it more than the once, and he hadn't needed to, for the words were burned into him now, whether he liked it or not. A woman was coming. A woman he had never met, arranged through the mails, and a stranger's promise, sent west to a waystation on a frozen flat to meet a man she knew only by a few lines of script. Amos had not told a living soul he'd answered that advertisement. A man who lives alone in the high country gets to thinking the silence is a comfort, and for years it had been. But there had come a night, deep in the long dark of the winter past, when the silence had turned on him and shown him its other face, the empty face, the face that asks a man who he's living for and offers no answer back. In a weak hour, or maybe an honest one, he had written away. And now, here he stood, the letter crumpled against his heart, watching his own horse stride off toward the very shelter where that woman was meant to wait. The wonder of it crawled up his spine like cold water. How could the animal know? How could a dumb beast point itself straight as a compass needle at a stranger camped a mile off in the dark? Amos was not a superstitious man, but standing there in the blue dusk, with his breath hanging white before him, he felt the small hairs rise along his arms. He took a step forward, out of the trees, then stopped. His boots had gone heavy as anvils. Whatever waited out there at the end of his horse's strange and certain journey, some part of him already understood. There'd be no turning from it now. Out at the way station, in the open doorway of that low timber shelter, a woman stood waiting with the patience of someone who'd long since learned that hurrying never once made the world. Her name was Nora, and she had come a very long way to stand in that doorway. Beside her, hung on a bent iron nail, driven into the doorframe years before by hands unknown, swung a battered tin lantern, its flame throwing a soft amber glow that pushed back the dark just far enough to make a little island of warmth in all that cold and empty country. The light caught the loose strands of her auburn hair and turned them the color of banked embers. It caught, too, the pale square of paper she held loosely in one hand, a folded letter sealed with dark wax and stamped with a postmaster's mark, the very twin of the one writing crumpled in a stranger's coat a mile across the flat, though neither of them knew that yet. Nora was not a woman given to fretting. She had buried more than one person she loved, had crossed more rough miles than most men ever dream of, and somewhere along the hard road of her years she had made her peace with whatever was coming. Her green eyes moved across the dark flat slow and steady, reading the land the way some folks read a page, taking in the shapes of the sage, and the long blue shadows, and the place where the last of the daylight was draining off, behind the hills. She had been told a man would come for her, a trapper, the letter said, a mountain man who kept to the high country and the lonesome places. She had no portrait of him, no notion of his face or his voice, only a few lines of careful script that spoke of a cabin and a quiet life and an honest willingness to share both. Other women might have trembled at such a thing, throwing their whole lot in with a stranger out at the edge of the known world. But Nora had learned that a stranger's hand, offered honest, was worth more than a familiar one offered false, and she had decided to trust the words on the page. So she waited. The cold pressed in around the little lantern light, and somewhere off in the dark, a coyote loosed a thin and wavering cry that rolled across the flat. And faded Nora pulled her shawl tighter, and then she saw it. A movement out there in the dusk, low and rhythmic, a darker shape against the dark, her breath caught soft in her throat. For a moment, she thought it must be the man himself, come at last. But no, the shape was wrong, four-legged and graceful. And as it drew nearer, her heart did something strange and sudden inside her chest. It was a horse, a gray horse, walking alone with no rider on its back, its reins trailing loose along the ground, coming on across the flat, straight toward her doorway, as though it had set out from the far side of the earth for no other purpose than to find her. Nora did not call out. She did not move back into the safety of the shelter. She simply stood there, in the warm amber lantern light, with the wax-sealed letter in her hand, watching that lone gray horse approach, and across her steady face there passed a look that was not surprise, as she could not yet see him. Amos crossed that flat on foot, and I'll tell you, it was the longest mile he ever walked in his life. The dark had come on full now, save for the cold scatter of stars overhead, and that one steady amber lantern out ahead of him. And toward that lantern he went, his boots crunching the frozen ground, his buckskin coat dusted white with the frost that had begun to settle on everything that didn't move. With every step, his breath came harder, not from the walking, for he was a strong man and used to far worse, but from the strange churning of feeling that rose in him the closer he drew. He'd started out across that flat, full of suspicion, the natural wariness of a man who has lived too long alone and learned to distrust anything that comes too easy. There's a trick in it somewhere, or a sickness, or some fool thing I'll be sorry for. But as he came on, and the shape of the shelter grew clearer, and he could make out the figure of a woman standing in its doorway with his gray horse's head bowed gentle to her hand, the suspicion in him began to crack and crumble and give way to something else entirely, something he hardly recognized for how long it had been since he'd felt it. Wonder. Plain, helpless wonder. The kind a child feels and a grown man buries deep. For there was Cutter, his own horse, the animal he'd raised from a leggy colt and trusted with his life through blizzards and river crossings and lonesome nights, without number, and that horse was standing as quiet and content beside this stranger woman. Quieter, maybe. There was a peace in the animal's whole bearing that Amos felt in his chest, like a hand laid flat against him. He slowed his steps, and slowed them again, until he was near creeping forward through the dark, afraid to break whatever spell hung over that lantern-lit doorway. The woman had not seen him yet, or if she had, she was speaking low to the horse, words Amos couldn't catch, and her free hand moved along the gray's neck in slow, easy strokes, and the horse leaned into every one of them like he'd known her touch all his days. Amos felt the breath go out of him. He stopped near 40 paces off and just stood there, in the frost and the dark, watching, his amber eyes fixed and shining in the far edge of the lantern's reach. In all his years, he had never once seen Cutter take to a soul so fast. The horse was a one-man animal, ornery to strangers, slow to trust, and yet here he stood. And the letter in Amos's coat pocket seemed all at once to weigh as much as a stone, for he understood now beyond any doubting that the woman in the doorway was the one the letter spoke of, the one sent west to meet him, and that his own horse had found her and named her and welcomed her into the fold before Amos had so much as glimpsed her face. He thought of all the years he'd spent telling himself he needed no one. He thought of the long winters with no voice but his own and the wind's, and how he'd called that peace when in truth it had been something nearer to a slow and quiet starving. He thought of the weak hour that had set his hand to writing that letter, and how shamed he'd felt of it ever since, and how that shame seemed, just now, to be melting off him like frost in the morning sun. He drew a long breath of the cold, sharp air, and then, because a man can only stand in the dark watching for so long, Amos squared his shoulders and stepped forward into the light. The two of them stood facing one another across the threshold of the shelter, with the iron lantern hanging between them, throwing its amber glow up across both their faces, and, for a long moment, not a word passed in either direction. Amos had come into the light, and Nora had turned at the sound of his boot, and now here they were, two strangers who had each crossed half a wilderness to stand in this one small circle of warmth, studying each other the way you study a riddle you suspect you ought to already know the answer to. Amos saw a woman of middling years, neither young nor worn, with auburn hair the lantern turned to copper and a pair of steady green eyes that met his own without the least flutter of fear, which surprised him, for a strange man stepping out of the dark on a lonesome flat is a thing most women would shy from. But she did not shy. She stood her ground in the doorway with one hand still resting on the gray horse's neck, and the other holding a folded square of paper down at her side, and she looked at him with a frank and searching calm that made him feel, all at once, both seeing, clear through. Nora, for her part, saw a tall and raw-boned man in a frost-dusted buckskin coat, his face all hard-weathered lines, a pale scar running down one side of his jaw, and eyes the color of old whiskey held to a candle. A solitary man, she judged at once, a man more comfortable with mountains than with people, and there was a wariness in the set of his shoulders that told her he'd as soon bolt as speak. But there was something else in him too, under the wariness, something raw and uncertain and almost young, and it touched her in a place she hadn't expected to be touched. The silence stretched between them, charged and full, and into it the lantern hissed, and the cold wind whispered along the eaves, and the gray horse let out a soft snort, shifting his weight as if to remind the both of them. It was Amos who finally broke it, and his voice came out rougher than he meant it to, hoarse from disuse and from the strange weight of the moment. "That's my horse," he said, and the moment the words were out, he could have kicked himself for the foolishness of them, for of all the things a man might say. But Nora did not laugh at him. She only looked down at the gray, and then back up at Amos, and the faintest gentling came into her eyes. "Then you'd be the one the letter spoke of," she said, and her voice was low and even and carried a music to it, some far-off green country, in the shape of the words, Amos's jaw. He looked at her, and he looked at the folded paper in her hand, and a cold understanding settled over him. Slowly, almost against his own will, he reached up to the breast of his coat and drew out his own crumpled letter and held it there a moment in the lantern light, where she could see it. Nora's eyes went from his letter to her own, and back again. And something passed over her face, a quiet settling, the way water settles after a stone goes still. Neither of them spoke. The gray horse stood between them with his head up now, his ears pricked forward, watching the both of them by turns with those great dark knowing eyes, as patient and certain as the night itself. And Amos thought, looking at this woman who had come all this way to a frozen flat to take a chance on a stranger, that maybe his horse had understood something this whole long while, that he himself, without a word spoken, his great gray neck, and as she did her face turned slightly toward Amos, her auburn hair catching the lantern gold, and she began to speak about the animal in a low and certain voice that Amos found he could not have looked away from if the shelter had caught fire around him. "I have known horses like this one before," she said, "not many. A man can live a long life and never meet but one or two. But I have known them, and so I know what I'm looking at when I look at him." Behind her, beyond the reach of the lantern, a great dark shape of granite outcrop loomed up against the stars, cold and ancient, and the gray horse stood quiet in the little island of light, with his head turned toward her words as if he too were listening. "My father gentled horses," she went on, "back in the old country, and after when we crossed over. He had a saying that a horse don't see the outside of a man the way the rest of the world does. He sees the inside. He sees what a man carries down where the man himself can't hardly look. And the good ones, the rare ones like this fellow here, they carry a kind of knowing that runs back further than their own lives, like they remember things they were never alive to see." He'd have called such talk foolishness 3 days past, the soft notions of a woman who'd read too many tales. But he'd watched his own horse walk a mile across a frozen flat to put his muzzle in this stranger's hand. And the foolishness didn't seem so foolish anymore. "How is it he came to you?" Amos asked low. "How is it he left me and came straight on to you, like he'd known where you'd be standing?" Nora was quiet a moment, stroking the gray's neck, and when she answered her voice had gone, soft as the falling dark. "I can't tell you the how of it," she said. "I don't believe the how of it is ours to know. But I'll tell you what I felt when he pressed his nose to my hand. I felt like something that had been lost a long time had come home." She turned then and looked at Amos full on, and her green eyes held a depth in them that made his breath go shallow. "I lost a great deal in my life," she said. "A husband, a child, before that, when she was small. After, I told myself I was done with caring for things, because caring for things only meant losing them, and I had lost about all a body can stand to lose. I made my heart into a cold room, and I shut the door on it." She drew a breath. "And then this horse of yours put his head in my hand tonight, and the door come open whether I willed it or not." Amos said nothing, but something in his own chest answered her, for he knew that cold room. He had called it freedom. He had called it peace. He had called it everything but what it truly was, which was a kind of slow dying a man does standing up. Out beyond the lantern, the granite stood black and eternal, and the cold pressed in, and the gray horse breathed his slow, contented breath. "The animal knew," Nora said quietly. "He knew what neither of us would let ourselves know. That we'd both been alone too long, and that the cure for it was standing 1 mile off across the dark. So he went and fetched it." And Amos, hearing this, felt the last of his suspicion drain clean out of him and leave behind it only a great and trembling openness, like the feeling of a wound finally beginning, after long years, to heal. That night, Amos did not sleep, but it was not the wakefulness of trouble. He sat just inside the open doorway of the shelter, his back against the rough timber jamb, the iron lantern burning low and steady at his side, its flame guttered down to a small, warm bead of light. Beyond him, framed in the doorway, against the deep blue dark, he could see the gray flank of Cutter, where the horse stood drowsing close to the shelter, one hind leg cocked, his great head low, content as Amos had ever seen him. Inside, behind him, Nora had at last lain down to rest, and Amos sat his quiet vigil with the cold night air on his face and the whole vast wheeling sky above. And he let himself think the thoughts he had spent 8 long winters refusing to think. The lantern light caught the pale scar along his jaw and through his weathered face, half in gold and half in shadow, and his head was bent, his amber eyes turned down toward his own rough hands, as a man's will when he is reckoning with something larger than himself. He thought back over the years he had spent alone in the high country. He had gone up there a younger man, fleeing a grief he'd never named to a soul, telling himself the mountains asked nothing of him, and so could take nothing from him. And for a while that had felt like wisdom. The silence had been clean. The solitude had been a kind of armor. But somewhere in those long years the armor had grown into a cage, and Amos had not even noticed the bars closing around him until this very night, when a stranger woman's words about a cold-shut room had described his own heart back to him so plainly he'd had to look away. He listened to the small sounds of the dark, the shift of the horse's hoof, the whisper of wind in the pines, the soft breathing of the woman behind him, and he marveled that such ordinary sounds could fill a man up so. For years he had heard only the wind and his own thoughts, and he had called that enough. He saw now that it had not been enough. It had never been enough. He had only been too proud and too frightened to admit the lack. He turned the matter over slow, the way he turned everything, for he was not a man who came to things quickly. The horse had known. That was the part that sat strangest with him, and yet by the deep cold middle of the night, the part that comforted him most. Cutter had carried him faithful through every hard year, had stood by him in storms that would have killed a lesser animal, had been near the only living thing Amos trusted in all the world. And tonight that horse had looked at the lonesome cage his master lived in, and had simply walked off to fetch the key. There was a kind of love in that, Amos thought, that he had not earned and did not rightly deserve, and the thought of it put a sting behind his eyes that he was glad no one was awake to see. The dark pressed close and gentle, and somewhere in those slow black hours, sitting in that doorway between the sleeping woman and the drowsing horse, Amos felt the long grip of his solitude begin, finger by finger, to loosen. He did not decide it all at once. A man like Amos decides nothing all at once. But by the time the first thin gray began to seep up over the eastern ridge, he had let go of something he'd held clenched so long he'd forgotten he was holding it, and his chest felt lighter for the loss of it, and emptier and fuller both at the same time. Dawn came up slow and clean over the pine ridge, and when the first hard light cracked the eastern rim of the world, Amos and Nora stood together outside the shelter, shoulder near to shoulder, watching it come. The frost lay thick and silver on every blade and branch, and as the sun lifted free of the ridge, it set the whole flat to glittering like a field of scattered jewels, and the cold breath of the two of them rose up together and mingled in the gold morning air. Between them, calm as still water, stood the dapple-grey horse, his head up now, his ears forward, his great dark eyes turned toward the rising light. And there was about all three of them a stillness and a rightness that needed no words at all. They had talked, in the deep of the night, and again in the gray before dawn, the way two people will. When they have decided to trust each other, she had told him of the green country she'd left, and the graves she'd left in it. He had told her haltingly of his own grief and the long flight into the mountains and the slow, cold years that followed. They had found, in the telling, that their two lonelinesses fit together like two halves of a broken thing, and that where they joined the break hardly showed at all. Now, in the clean light of morning, there was nothing left to decide. Amos looked out at the sun, cracking the ridge, and felt the warmth of it begin to touch his face. And in his amber eyes there was an expression he had not worn in years, an open and resolved and unguarded look, the look of a man who has stopped running and found, to his great surprise, that the thing he'd been running from was the very thing he'd needed all along. He drew a long breath of the cold, sweet air. "I came down off that mountain 100 times," he said quietly, watching the light spread gold across the flat. "Came down for supplies, for trade, for what have you. And every time I climbed back up alone, and every time I told myself that was how I wanted it." Nora said nothing, only stood close, her shoulder a warmth against his arm. "I don't reckon I'll climb back up alone again," he said, "if you'll come." And Nora turned and looked at him, and the morning light caught the green of her eyes and the copper of her hair, and she smiled, the first full smile he had seen from her, and it changed her whole face the way sunrise changes a valley. "I'll come," she said simply. The gray horse, as if he had understood every word of it, lowered his great head and pressed his muzzle once, soft, against Amos's hand, and then against Nora's, joining them so, and a strange thick feeling rose up in Amos's throat that he did not try to swallow down. He laid his hand on the horse's neck and looked at this animal that had known, somehow, all along, that had walked off across a frozen flat in the failing light to fetch his fool master. "You old devil!" Amos murmured to the horse, and there was a wet shine in his eyes, and no shame in it. "You knew?" The horse only breathed his slow warm breath and gazed off toward the climbing sun. And so they stood there, the three of them together in the gold of that first morning, the man and the woman and the gray horse between them, watching the light come up over the pines and burn the frost away. The long solitude was over. It had ended, not with any grand decision of Amos's own making, but with the quiet certain knowing of a faithful animal who had loved him better than he'd loved himself. And out there on that wide and lonesome country, the new day came on, warm and bright, and for once in all his weathered years, Amos was not alone to meet it. The morning had answered the question he'd been too proud to ask, and the answer, all along, had been standing right there beside him on 4 gray legs, waiting, patient as the dawn, for him to finally understand.